I'm Bill Backus. I'm Midwest agronomist for BASF. We are at the BASF Story City Research Farm. Today we're going to talk about our history of germplasm. And what I want to start off with is the history of soybean cyst nematodes. So first identified in northeast China in 1899. Fast forward to the Midwest, first identified in Missouri in 1957, then identified in Iowa and Minnesota in 1978. 2020, EPA petitions the EPA for the GMB 151, which is a plant parasitic nematode trait that we're actually going to develop and are in developing. And we're going to be breeding that with the Enlist E3 trait going forward for proprietary germplasm. So we're going to talk about germplasm throughout the years, and as we get to the end, we'll come back around with a history of traits. So I want to start off with Peking, PI 548402. Plant introduction is what the PI stands for, and it is the oldest one I have in here, 1906. As you see here in the black seeded native seed variety, it is a very rough seeded coat. It's smooth, it's oblong, it's not smooth like normal soybeans that you have today, and it's very unique when you get to that point. It's a group 4 soybeans, so very hard to breed with, to bring stuff in for high yield genetics, but we are getting to that point of getting those genetics bred in today. So moving on to PI 88788, which is the #1 source of soybean cyst nematode resistance that we have here in the Midwest. This was found in China in about 1930, and as we added this to our breeding lines, we found that it had cyst resistance in 1962. So that is in 98% of the varieties that we have today, and with that we are starting to see resistance develop to this native trait. So that's why we're looking at the biotech trait as we continue forward in this history of soybean germplasm. So here we have Mandel. Mandel is selected from Manchu in 1926, first introduced in the U.S. in 1934, actually by Purdue Ag Experimental Station. The main reason for including Mandel in this demonstration, this is really when soybeans were really starting to kind of become a crop. People really didn't know what to do with them, so they actually started using it as a protein source, primarily for feedstock. So they really chopped this bean, really didn't take it to grain, really used it for the chopping purposes for their livestock. So as you move on to Hawkeye, this is kind of where we start into the Iowa part of the presentation. Hawkeye is actually named after the Hawkeye state. The breeders used all the names here in the northern part of the Midwest, if you will, for using local areas, geographical areas, things like that. In the South, conversely, they actually used generals, and that's how they named their beans after generals. So as you look at the Hawkeye here, released in 1947, really one of the first varieties bred for commercial production. So the next variety we have is Ford. So released in 1958 by the Iowa Ag Experimental Station, and basically it's a cross of Lincoln by Richland. And if you go back in history and you look at these different varieties, they both brought some very unique characteristics. But we'll pause for a second. Ford brings to, what's Ford mean? What's that name? Well, it's a Ford vehicle. So let's talk about what Henry Ford actually did basically in soybean breeding. So he's actually one of the pioneers that really nobody knows about unless you do a little research on him. He actually developed a lot of varieties. He's tested like 2,000 varieties over the course of his career. And in 1941, he actually made a complete car out of plastic. In August of 1941 is when he introduced this car to the public. It was a great hit, but what happened is December of 1941. War, basically Pearl Harbor, and as we introduced that in there, all of his production got shifted over to the war effort, so hence the plastic car never really gained any momentum and went any further. But what he did do for us is a lot of research and understanding on basically developing processes to understand how to develop lots of things out of soybeans, oil, fibers. If you go back into the proteins just in meat and whatnot, so he was actually a pioneer way ahead of his time when he got into that point. So good little segue onto that, but really nothing to do with that variety, but just talk about that when it says Ford right there. People always ask that question, what's that mean? So as you get into Williams is one of the most influential varieties ever made for soybeans because it is in the background of so many varieties that we have today. Williams 79 brought in the 1C phytophthora gene. Williams 82 brought in the 1K phytophthora gene. It is in the background of many, many, many varieties. As you look at these lists of the varieties that we have here, and a lot of historical varieties, a lot of people know when they start reading through these list of varieties that we have presented here today. Behind me here we have a variety called Essex. It is actually not Essex, it's actually another variety because Essex is a group 5 soybean and I can't raise that here in the Midwest and actually get it to maturity. So what we're using today is a credenz variety, 3930 as a demonstration. So Essex basically crossed with Williams yields the next variety, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But Essex, again, coming from Virginia Ag Experimental Station. As we move into the cross with Williams by Essex, we get Asgrow A3127. It's a 3.1 maturity that is widely used in a lot of the backgrounds throughout the entire soybean industry today. Main reason for this one being in here, this really starts the private side of soybeans, is really where it kind of segues from public over to the private introduction and all the efforts in the private breeding efforts that we're going to talk about for the rest of the tour. Behind me we have Cumberland. Cumberland is a unique variety simply because it's named after a town in southwest Iowa, and it released in 1978 by Iowa Ag Experimental Station and the Puerto Rico Ag Experimental Station. Found in the pedigrees of a lot of varieties there as well. But again, as we start looking for varieties, you got the internet today, you start looking to find yields. This one's actually, you can find some yields from 1978, 1979. It was one of the top yielders in that era of about 40, 45 bushels to the acre is what you found throughout Iowa and actually into Nebraska when you look at that. So move on to Vinton. Vinton basically also named for a town in Iowa. Actually, this is a variety that is still planted today. This is actually a clear hilum variety, as you see close in the picture here, used for making tofu is really a main effort around this variety. Conventional, you can see here the weeds that are coming in this thing. If you look back at that, we see a lot of grass, actually it's really cut grass in there. You see we did do a cultivation pass in this, trying to control some of the weeds here on these, because everything prior to where we're at now has been a conventional soybean. We're going to be talking about some herbicide tolerant soybeans here coming up in a little bit. But Vinton 81, key variety, still used today, developed again by the Iowa Ag Experimental Station. Right next to me here we have Pella, basically named after a town in southeast Iowa, and released in 1979 by the Iowa Ag Experimental Station and Puerto Rico Ag Experimental Station. Key to this one is it's Wayne crossed by the Williams, and we actually get, or Pella 86 is Pella crossed by Williams 82, actually gives us the 1K gene, back to that Williams discussion earlier, to bring in a very widely used variety, a Group 3, very popular variety here in Iowa at the time in 1979. Right next to me here we have Hobbit. So Hobbit was released in 1981. Very unique variety because it was bred for a practice that was coming in the 80s of drilled soybeans. We're trying to figure out at that point in time for all these soybeans how to get them to yield, and then all of a sudden their weeds are showing up, how we control weeds. So weed control practices using cultural practices, we're getting to that point in the 80s, and Hobbit was a key variety because it was bred to be very short, bred to be narrow rows, 7-inch rows, 10-inch rows, whatever it may be in a drilled situation, so we can get to that point. So a key variety, mainly breeding for a cultural practice to control weeds. So as we continue on to the next variety, Jack. Jack is where we start looking at a core-based variety in herbicide introduction or herbicide trait introduction. Released by University of Illinois in 1989. It is basically used in the background of every single trait introduction that we're going to talk about here next. Variety right next to me is actually an STS variety, which actually is the grandfather of herbicide tolerance. So it is not a biotech trait, it's actually an ALS1 trait that was identified basically for the use of sulfonylurea herbicides in soybeans. So last year we actually were able to use the sulfonylurea, the Synchrony STS, which would be a product by DuPont that was used in the 90s. And last year we were able to demonstrate here at the Story City Research Farm all of the ALS resistant water hemp by sorting out those with that herbicide program. This year I used a variety here that's actually Liberty tolerant, so we'd actually have clean beans behind us today, but it is actually an Enlist E3 STS stack variety here in a demonstration today. So ALS1 is basically what we had for the STS soybeans, and then Corteva now has a product or a variety that's Bolt is what they call it, which is ALS1 and ALS2. We'll move on to the next variety, which is Roundup Ready 1. So this is actually the first genetically modified herbicide trait introduced by Monsanto in 1996. Really was used for many, many years with success. A lot of people were able to clean the fields that we were talked about earlier with the drilled beans, and progressing through the 90s and or the 80s and 90s and into the late 90s with the introduction of the Roundup Ready technology. So as we just talked about Roundup Ready 1 in the previous segment, this would be the Roundup Ready to Yield. So in 1996, Roundup Ready 1 was introduced. 13 years later, 2009, Monsanto introduced Roundup Ready to Yield. Main reason for that was a new insertion point for that biotech trait to confer the glyphosate tolerance to make it Roundup Ready. Also brought in higher yield potential with the Roundup Ready to Yield. That was kind of thought to see a yield drag with that initial trait, improve the trait. Took 13 years to basically get that trait insertion point identified to get a better, cleaner, higher yielding variety. So take Roundup Ready to Yield, cross that with a trait from the University of Nebraska, which is a dicamba trait, and we get Roundup Ready to Extend soybeans. So that allows us to use the dicamba herbicide in soybeans for the first time in the year of 2016. So as BASF, this is where we enter the discussion as we purchased the LL27 trait from Bayer at that point in time when we had the merger here recently. And as you think about the LL27, what is it? What does it bring to the table? What's the difference here? Actually, the LL27 trait was actually first identified back in the late 90s, but was not finished because of the success of the Roundup Ready trait at that point in time. So as we look at 2008, when the LO27 was actually first introduced into the marketplace, main reason for its success at that point in time was the glyphosate resistant weeds, and it followed that resistance from the south to the north, and we started seeing more success with the LO27. The key breeding point of this is a germplasm discussion. LO27 does not breed easily and convey its liberty tolerance or glufosinate tolerance over to its prodigy, basically, as you're breeding through that. So as we keep talking, we'll talk about the new one here, LO55, which I'll segue to that briefly. It's much better, and that's why we transitioned to that. So LO27 was important in the day, but really is off patent and is no longer used. As we move on to the GT27, this is a glyphosate HPPD tolerance. This is where MS Technology enters into the discussion. And again, our partnership, BASF with MS Tech, has been a key partnership, really based upon this point in time. When we take the LO27, we looked at that, we had that in the pipeline, but then we also started looking at this GT27, which is glytol. The GT stands for that, so it's glyphosate tolerance, which is key because it's not Roundup Ready technology. It's actually a double mutated version of the EPSPS gene, and that makes it a different gene because it was widely used in cotton. So the glytol was able to be moved into the soybeans. The HPPD component, that's what the 27 stands for, the GT27, makes it tolerant to, at this point in time, we're talking about isoxaflutol. And again, BASF's herbicide would be Elite 27. And that's where we're getting this stacking different herbicide traits to combat weeds. As we've talked all the way through here, we're starting to see different breeding efforts, conventional efforts, different row spacing efforts, and we're trying to get into herbicide tolerance, and we're battling resistant weeds at this point in time. Right beside me here we have LO55. So this is the new trait I referenced earlier when we were talking about LO27. This is LO55, and again, I didn't say it earlier, but the 2.7 in the LO27 actually stands for the 2.7 maturity variety that was used to introduce the trait. LO55 actually stands for a group 5.5 maturity soybean that was used to introduce the trait. The key thing on the LO55 is it has two dominant alleles, basically in a breeding program. This will convey the liberty tolerance, glufosinate tolerance, basically through the breeding effort. So all future traits, when we're looking at liberty tolerance and liberty linked gene, will utilize the LO55 trait in all their breeding efforts. So key to that is we go back to the FG72 or the GT27, we cross that with the LO55, we come up with LOGT27. And that's one of the major traits that are used today in soybean production, and again conveys glufosinate, glyphosate, and HPPD tolerance. And again, in BASF side, we use that in the Credenz brand. So as we finish up with LGT27, introduced in 2018, we move into the Enlist E3 trait, which is introduced in 2019. So introduced by Dow AgroSciences, and it conveys tolerance to the 2,4-D choline, glyphosate, and glufosinate. Again, a major player today, continues to grow in popularity, widely used, and this is the trait that we use in our Zetavo soybean brand. So as we leave the Enlist E3 trait, it also has the tolerance to glufosinate, does not conveyed by the LL55 trait, but actually conveyed by the PAT gene. As we look and move forward into Extend Flex, which has been approved here recently and is now becoming a widely used trait, it has the Extend and the LL55, two traits in it, which conveys the Liberty tolerance basically in this trait. So we end up with a glyphosate, dicamba, and glufosinate tolerance in Extend Flex. So again, widely used, growing in popularity as well, and will continue to be a major player. So as we stop and recap, we've got the LGT27, we got the Enlist E3, and we got the Extend Flex. Those would be the three major platforms that are used by soybean producers today to combat weeds. So as we look at transitioning into the future pipeline, this is where I want to stop and talk about all of our breeding efforts at BASF and what we're looking at for the future. So we referenced early when we started on the soybean cyst nematode trait, GMB 151. This is just a variety that I'm using to demonstrate. This is not nematode resistant soybean because it is still being regulated as a breeding trials, but we are using this in our breeding efforts today. Trait developed by BASF. Again, a plant parasitic nematode protected soybean. Really, as we look at that, what that is, it's actually a BT gene that's actually expressed below ground. It also conveys tolerance to the HPPD class of chemistries. And as we look at that moving forward, will be used in a lot of breeding efforts widely, I imagine, throughout the soybean industry. So key bean, as we're looking forward, again, developed by BASF. Next two are just real quick. I've got two new herbicide traits in the pipeline, not naming what they are, but just wanted to let you know that we are working other options within the soybean industry to help manage everything that we have in as far as weed management practices. So as we've discussed really everything that we've talked about here today, we've talked about soybeans, we've talked about germplasm, we've talked about traits. So really as we want to stop and we want to look back, you think about soybean genetic gain over the years, we basically have gone from about 4/10 of a bushel average since 1925 to more recently, we've gone up to 1.3 bushels yield gain in our breeding efforts. But more recently than that, when you really segment it out, we've actually gained about 15% year over year when we start looking at more recent breeding efforts. So a lot of focus on that, a lot of key developments as we're looking at different lines, different marker-assisted breeding, different genetic selection, everything that we're looking at, and all of our production practices as we look forward, especially working with BASF, what we're doing. But the importance of germplasm is really the key thing that we're talking about here today. As we think about the varieties that are being developed, they're being developed by 6 core companies, and BASF being one of those. So you can see on the slide which ones they are. But I do want to transition as we kind of wrap things up here into soybean high yield management, because that's really what we've been talking about here the whole day, is getting to that point of that. And everything that we look at from the center of everything that we have is variety selection. So you start with that, and then we can spider web out of that with all the other management factors we're going to talk about in other segments of our video series. As we look at the whole acre that BASF can basically convey and protect from a seed treatment standpoint, from the germplasm, seeds and traits standpoint, all the way through from a crop protection acre all the way to a plant health acre that we're trying to protect that, as well as an insecticide to basically control insects at the end of the year. So that's what we want to transition into. But at the end of the day, when you really think about it, we want to talk about how do we get more yield. Yield is equal to the pods per acre, it's equal to seeds per pod, and it's equal to weight per seed. So all those little factors are what we're going to talk about in other segments as we go forward here. So again, for more information, please contact your local BASF representative.